Welcome, I'm Denise Graves, and you're watching Opera America's Oral History Project.
Great to see you, Mark. And how's everything going? I mean, how are you feeling?
Well, it has been an incredibly challenging couple of years, and yet I am so inspired by the amount of inventiveness and initiative, especially by artists, to continue to express creatively, even when they weren't able to be on stage. So I am deeply inspired and hope we don't just snap back to what was, because what wasn't good enough.
Your eloquence is undeniable, and can I just say, I think as always, when things get tough, human beings come up with amazing new approaches and new
Yeah,
things that need to happen. And the old stuff was great in its time, but the time has changed,
yeah,
and we have lots of memories of fantastic things, but there's a new set of things to do right now,
yeah.
and the world needs something else.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And
so
we as individuals, I think, need something else. I we should be starting the interview because we'll capture this. But I'm a big believer in the concept of repotting yourself. Just as you need to repot a plant, you do need to pick yourself up and put yourself into fresh soil every so often.
yeah. Or, in fact, don't plant yourself in a pot, but plant yourself in the earth
Yeah.
so you
I'll
can put
take you
down
on that one.
real roots.
Absolutely.
And the
Absolutely. Okay.
roots don't end up curling around and round and around in the bottom of the
Yeah.
pot.
Well,
Uh,
well said. Well said. Uh, Peter Sellars, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. We started this oral history project back before COVID as part of our 50th anniversary celebration. And the project was interrupted, but we've picked it back up, and we are so delighted to add you to the luminaries, very much at the top of that list for this oral history project. Thank you, sir.
Other way, Mark. And just can I just say thank you for serious leadership? Thank you for serious vision. Thank you for moving everybody to the next place
You know,
and
that,
really
that,
making that possible, because what people need is encouragement. they These are hard times, and you're providing encouragement, and you're modeling really beautiful possibilities for people. Thank you so much.
well, it's a team effort. As you know, it's a team
Mm,
effort.
mm.
I start every interview with the same question, and this one is, Peter Sellars, who brought you to your first opera?
Wow. Okay. I first started hearing opera on records, so I really imagined these incredible things from early records that I had, like Thomas Beecham's version of Mozart's Abduction from the Seraglio, and I was staging it all in my mind, and it was super exciting. And so when I actually finally got to an opera, it was a little boring. I thought, well, wait a minute. All these amazing things were going on that I was imagining when I was hearing the recordings. But what I have to say, what was amazing was I was going to school in Massachusetts. And so what was happening was Sarah Caldwell was making these incredible, crazy productions of crazy repertoire.
Yeah.
And so early on, the repertoire that I was exposed to was very, very progressive, very interesting, and at that time revolutionary. She was the first person to do Les Troyens and to do,
Hmm.
you know, Nono's Intolleranza and
And
Lulu.
Benvenuto Cellini,
I
I
mean,
remember.
so all these wild things. So that was wonderful to see opera in a very, very, very progressive frame of mind and a repertoire that was constantly challenging. And, there were certain performers that came and worked with Sarah every year, like Shirley Verrett, who you just went, what? That's what the art form is. And so that was super exhilarating. And when I was 18, my mother moved our family to Paris. And so I saw the Paris Opera in the kind of great moment, a great era of total avant-garde, and it was very, very, very inspiring to see some Patrice Chéreau's first productions, and of course to hear, that amazing Giorgio Strehler Figaro, conducted by Schulte, with
Schulte, yeah.
the young Jose Van Damme and the young Teresa Stratas as Figaro and Susanna, and the young Teresa Braganza as Carabino, and you just go, oh, 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 oh. And it's all done with such care and such fantastic humor and such, sharp edge, and just very, very beautiful, very inspiring. So I had a lot of early fantastic experiences.
Yeah. Well, I want to pick up on a few things you just said, Peter. So that when you first started listening on records, and just for the record, I am 7 days older than you are. So, when you're talking about vinyl and some of your cast and early performances, we're 1 week apart. So I know your era very well. The You
May I
said
say
you
happy
started
birthday,
listening
by
to.
the way? May I say happy birthday, Mark?
Oh well, but
Libras?
I'll follow up with 7 days later to you. Um, so when you started listening to records, you imagined staging, and I'm fascinated by that. Experience I didn't have. I just listened to the music. You were listening and imagining staging. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, I apprenticed at a marionette theater in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, starting at the age of 10, the Lovelace Marionettes. And of course, for most puppet shows, the kids want to hear music. And so grew up staging things to music.
Yeah.
And all of the Lovelace Marionette shows had incredible music that were part of the shows. And then they did puppet shows for adults using the French surrealists. So they did Jean Cocteau's Wedding on the Eiffel Tower. So I was early on brought up in this atmosphere of Stravinsky and the French surrealists, and also, that music itself was theatrical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
the puppet theater was all about miracles and surprising transformations, and people flying or descending from the sky, or all those phenomenal things that, of course, opera is about. Is this magical, profound, metaphysical level that is constantly opening the possibilities of life.
when did you connect with the possibility of opera as your primary medium of creative expression? Was it after seeing Sarah Caldwell and work in Paris? Was it watching marionette theater and listening to records at home? When did you feel that opera was going to be how you expressed yourself?
Well, it's, I think because my life is involved with so many elements, theater, of course, but film and visual art and architecture and dance and really community projects. A lot of, community projects where art is part of the fabric of life itself. So for me, my connection to opera isn't just in the sense of the official opera repertoire or opera houses, which I actually haven't worked in that many opera houses in my life. It's more the kind of festivals and things that I've done. And opera is where all the art forms meet. And so it was this logical meeting place
Mm-hmm.
for working with painters, for working with architects, for working with great writers, for working with, of course, musicians, and working with dancers. Opera was the space that we could all meet in, and had that thrilling anthropological root system that was, going back to, African villages and Korean rituals for the dead, and Aboriginal, gatherings in the desert in the middle of the, in a solstice for a dawn. Opera is that place that is so deep for what it means to be alive and be human, and at the same time be trying to touch the edges of infinity and the universe. And so I think of it as the continuation. That the big opera houses are opposite City Hall in the major
Mm-hmm.
cities. That it's you're in this place that is civic. It is the Greeks invented it as a maintenance system for democracy, realizing that democracy needs to be maintained and attended to every day, like feeding your kids. It's the on how do you keep democracy alive and healthy? Opera. And so the Greeks realized you had to tell stories that were tragic, that were unbearable, that there are all these things we're not doing well as a society, or even as families, or even as individuals. And you have to make a space to talk about the things you can't even talk about in your own family. You can't talk about because you don't want to face those things. And you need to face those things with music, poetry, dance, and beauty, because that's the only way we can deal with this stuff. And if you don't deal with it, you're in trouble.
Hmm.
And so opera is this urgent life support system, is this urgent maintenance system for democracy, has all these incredibly deep, deep, deep root systems that are about, how do we keep a society alive and healthy and morally in focus and in
Yeah.
tune. And that idea of this collaborative project that involves the person pulling the curtain and the oboe player and the person sewing the costumes, and that we're doing something that takes a whole society to create, because we're trying to address a whole society.
So magnificently said. And every time I hear you speak, you just awaken so many ideas so beautifully expressed. At college, at Harvard, sort of your first opera foray was a puppet version of the Ring Cycle. And I now understand from the Marionette Theater how looking at a puppet version was a really natural outgrowth of your childhood expressiveness. Like suddenly I get that. And then Antony and Cleopatra in a swimming pool. And what fascinates me, the creativity, but the second piece is that you jumped in with two monumental works, The Ring Cycle and Antony and Cleopatra. So no timid college student what made you, or were you just too young to think about the fact that you were tackling two of the monumental works of Western civilization?
No, I mean, I was obsessed with Stravinsky. I grew up with Stravinsky on the mind. In high school, I did for 6 months a soldier story. I was obsessed with Stravinsky. And in college, I had a huge argument with a composer who said, no, Wagner. And of course, I thought Wagner was horrifying. And because I believe Stravinsky, that was the mother's milk. And so you couldn't have the two coexisting. And then every summer I had a children's theater in Denver, Colorado, the Elitch Theater for Children. And then one summer we were performing the entire summer, 5 shows a day in Larimer Square in downtown Denver. And the rather brilliant woman who was one of the first people to restore, older parts of cities and bring them back, amazing Dana Crawford, she said, would you come down and just do 5 shows a day downtown in this restored part of Denver, Colorado that we're bringing back? And we were 3 blocks from what was literally billed as the largest Woolworths in the world. And we thought, well, we've got to do something grand for this situation. And meanwhile, part of my group was this composer who was obsessed with Wagner. And so I said, okay, let's check out Wagner. Let's do the Ring Cycle. and so, the Rainbow Bridge came from the 4th floor men's room of an adjacent office building, and all of that stuff. And we just set downtown Denver alive with this thing. And of course, then I realized you couldn't cut a note of Wagner as soon as I had to cut each opera to an hour. And then it was very, very moving. And I took it really seriously. And there was some comedy, as there has to be in Wagner, but also a lot of pathos. So bizarrely, people were coming from Seattle. People were coming from all over the place to see this Ring Cycle in the street in downtown Denver. And then when I went back to Cambridge, we did it indoors at Harvard, but it was born in the street, and it was
Wow.
born for passersby. There was no admission charge; you just showed up, and so the audience was, the Valkyries were coming from way down the street. It was this whole scene, and we had we did it with 6 people, and and it was very exciting and ambitious and thrilling. And of course, it gave me a lifelong love of Wagner.
Sure, sure.
And at the same time, that sense that again, Wagner's project was informed by this Greek, the
Hmm.
imagination of Greek theater, of what are the tales we have to tell each other to talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it and
Yeah,
how we
yeah.
could do it and what are we dealing with all this, what's the obsession with money and all that stuff that is like right there. And when you're a teenager, that stuff is so to the point. And so I think we made a version of it that was very, very real and very moving, at the same time done with puppets. And so it had this this freedom to it, as it were. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Did you mentioned Sarah Caldwell, and I always like following the paths of people. I only met and spoke to Sarah once in extended time, but only once. Did you know her? And you've spoken about her creativity. What was she like?
Well, she was impossible. She was impossible. She was crazy. She did not like me in any way. It was very irritating to her. On the other hand, I did work with her. We did our Julius Caesar in her season one year, and so we got to see each other. I mean, her again, for me, what was beautiful was her constant thirst for works that hadn't been done yet. And so again, to be around for the first Soldaten, the first Lulu, the first Ruslan and Ludmila. I mean, on and on and on. These just beautiful operas that she would bring to life in her crazy way.
Yeah.
And of course, I knew a lot of the musicians who played in the orchestra. I knew a lot of the people in the chorus because I was working at Emmanuel Church in Boston, and that was my years in Boston were really focused more in Emmanuel Church with the ensemble there because they did a Bach cantata every Sunday. And
Hmm.
so we were going through the complete cycle of Bach cantatas. And that was the real learning curve because Bach was music that was about a 12-step program for people who were in trouble and how you put your life back together and what it meant when you're how you talk someone down off a bridge. And that's what music did. That's what Bach was about, saying, okay, this is your drinking problem. This is why you can't look at yourself. This all those cantatas were about that. And then we did the Mozart operas, on their spare time, and we rehearsed them in the library of the church.
Wow.
And so it was this idea that and again, I've said it before, but it was something in Emmanuel Church to work on Don Giovanni in a place that had 3 chapters of AA and a chapter of NA, and you're staging Don Giovanni, and the smoke from the AA meeting downstairs is coming up through the floor, and meanwhile there was a Salvadoran underground railroad refugee program. There was a shelter for battered women, and you're in the same building staging Act Two of Marriage of Figaro, and you get why the Countess doesn't appear before noon,
Hmm.
and you get that there's a lot of violence that she tries not to mention, and you see why what Mozart invests that clarinet solo with, and you see that it's the winds are there for everything that we're not able to say,
Yeah.
and so staging those operas in that context where they were feeding people who are living on the street, you know you realize that opera, of course, is food. Opera is, how do we feed people? How do we feed people in the deepest parts of their beings where they're very hungry?
You know, in that remarkable description, Peter, you mentioned both Julius Caesar, Handel with Sarah, and then the Mozart operas, and you have such accomplishment in the works of the 18th century, the Mozart Beaumarchais trilogies, the trilogy, and Handel operas. What is it about the Handel works and the Mozart works that make them so available for connection to our world today?
Well, I think that 19th century was this time of grand empire, and kind of you have to take most of those things for granted if you're doing 19th century opera of like, yes, empire is what we're here to celebrate. And of course, we're in a period where we don't really want to celebrate empire. We realize that was a wrong turn for most things in our culture. And we're left with financial and social systems that and political systems that are not appealing and actually have had dire results in many cases. And so the 18th century is, first of all, this moment of the quote unquote enlightenment, where there's this idea of people saying, what else can we do? Are there other structures? Which is what Mozart operas are about. That's the French Revolution. Could we have another structure? Because we're dealing with structural violence. We're dealing with structural levels of inequality that are just unacceptable. And so Mozart was saying, okay, inequality, I'm going to break through in this opera. I'm going to break through every time I write a string quartet. It's about these four people are equal. And now I'm going to make that quartet human beings in Idomeneo, human beings in The Marriage of Figaro, in Don Giovanni, in that suddenly a quartet, which is the structure of equality in music, became a structure of equality in the world. So for me, this 18th century material was so, well, not all of it, but God knows Mozart. And Handel was working in this context of the invention of the oratorio in Enlightenment England, which is how do we, if we're going to have a democracy, we don't want democracy to be based on people saying the lowest, meanest, stupidest, most telling lies in public and falsifying their experience. How can you stand up in public and say something you believe deeply in your heart and not fake it, not devalue it, but actually value your highest thoughts, your highest self, your highest feeling? So Handel was involved in this project of oratorio, which was taking these biblical, mostly biblical things, but of course, other historical topics, and saying, okay, how enlightened and empowering could the social structures become? And what is inspired leadership? Inspired leadership rarely coming from the official leader, but from this new generation of David in the oratorio Saul, of Theodora in the oratorio Theodora, of a future. And these beautiful Handel oratorios are this image of a future with new voices, new leadership, infusing and renewing these old structures which are finished. And he would show you old time corruption. In most of those oratorios are about the corruption of the official state, and then these courageous people who frequently paid for their lives, with their lives, for trying to invest it with new hope, new meaning, honesty, equality, and a kind of moral energy that was about treating people correctly. And so the Handel material has, just like the music for the Messiah, it's inspiring forever because he's truly trying to uplift and inspire a new society. And in a way, that's why Handel had no successors in England, because nobody could sustain that level of vision. And of course, Mozart, he's in a period of social upheaval, but also just unbelievable violence, and and of course sexual violence. And so his big project of forgiveness is, how do we reach across the lines? How do we forgive each other? And can we say, okay, the only way we can move forward is, can we actually forgive each other? Because yes, there are abuses, there are unbelievable abuses. Now, how do we forgive each other? And Mozart wrote the soundtrack for forgiveness.
Yep.
And so those people appealed really deeply. And meanwhile, the third element in my life at that point was Bach. So that was really the foundational work. But of course, it was also the foundational work that made Nixon in China make sense, because I was doing Handel's Julius Caesar in Egypt. Like, what happens when the Western leader visits the Middle East? So from Julius Caesar in Egypt to Nixon in China was not a big step. And of course, Handel's gift was to make these things very amusing, very strange, very delicious, and devastating and profound. and and
Hmm.
and because Handel had lunch with Henry Kissinger every day, Handel was in the upper echelon of
Hmm.
British, officialdom and highest social echelon. So he had access to the people who were the leaders, and so he could put their behavior and down like with unbelievable exactitude. so so all those things about the 18th century materials really interested me a lot
Sure.
and were quite formative. And meanwhile, Bach as just having that grounding of, how can you address people's real issues
Yeah.
and the things that people are ashamed of and the things that are holding us all back? How can we put that forward?
Now, you took a step into my next question because here you're talking so beautifully about the 18th century repertoire, and another pillar of your creative accomplishment is new work. And I'm wondering whether in creating new work you have a different creative process from interpreting work that's had 250 or 300 years of performance history and layers of interpretation and contextualization in the political times. In approaching a new work, is it a totally different activity for you or all connected?
Well, I think everything's in some kind of continuum, of course, some kind of flow through. But I mean, what you're saying is what hasn't been said yet. What about how we're living now couldn't be said in the 18th century? What are the things that are actually that couldn't be said in the 19th century? What can we say now that couldn't be said? And how do we understand things now that in a way they've never been understood before? What is the world we're living in proposing to us that it never proposed to Mozart or Handel or Sophocles? And so the actual nature of the simultaneity of our worlds, of course, new opera is essential because our generation has new questions and has new possibilities. So yes, and of course, same deal working with composers. Obviously, John Adams or Kaya Sarajevo or Osvaldo Golijov are all beautiful, brilliant, inspired people with real visionary subject matter in their hearts. So it's not that I have to lead them to water. They're already there, and they're already want to do something that has impact at all of those levels of humanity and in a profound political context. And so what it means to again work with like a writer like Alice Goodman or Amin Malouf, these are, and bring those people into the circle of opera. Uh, uh, it's very exhilarating. And of course, as always, when you hire artists, you get art, and you always get something that you could never have ever anticipated. It's That's the beautiful thing is, when John Adams shows up with the music, you go, what? This is incredible, and it's nothing like you could have imagined. And
Hmm.
that's the beautiful thing of creating new work is it genuinely is new, and it goes to places you could not have predicted. And I think that we're living in a deeply unpredictable time, and so that the fact that it has no predictability is one of the most important things about the new work, and that each work has to break some kind of new ground and open in a place that we need openings.
Hmm.
Places that are right now closed in our world, and how do you open them? How do you create openings in these spaces? And I think we do go to the place the Greeks were at, which is one of the things that we're unable to say aloud. Okay, we're going to say them very aloud. I mean, obviously, as you know, uh, the project of, the atomic bomb, which we're still paying for. I mean, the reason we have cancer all over the world, it's not an accident. I mean, the epidemic, the cancer epidemic, of course, is because we introduced uh, we introduced radiation into our world in a way that is permanently toxic. And that was a project where the government, behaved in total secrecy, and there was a government inside the government to create, which is right now continuing, in a democracy, things that none of us would ever have voted for. And that goes on. And this whole program that was meant to be top secret the pleasure is now we can go to the Freedom of Information Act and get things, secret documents out that they were meant to be hidden from the American public forever, and John Adams can set them to music for orchestra and chorus. And suddenly
Hmm.
this thing you were not meant to hear is powerfully in front of you.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's that same question of what is still unspoken, what can people not acknowledge, or what has to be whispered. And that's what you set for orchestra, chorus, and very
Hmm.
gifted soloists.
Um, Peter Sellars as librettist. So you have written libretti, and the libretto, such a challenging aspect of opera, to create words that are worthy of being sung, words that motivate singing and leave room for music, and somehow bring you to a place that was hitherto unspoken, as you said so well. So why is this libretto thing so hard, and how have you tackled it as a librettist?
Well, I would just say I do not consider myself a writer in any way because I've worked with very great writers. But the libretti that I've created have been more in the spirit of a documentary film of what does it mean to do the research and actually put together these little pieces of research that create a real story. And actually don't just create a story, but create an approach to a story and an angle of a story and a kind of particular way of looking at that story and hearing it. So mostly, of course, I'm everything that I do is in that direction is based on very specific historical research and use of historical documents and poetry, and how you link the poetry to the documentary evidence. And for me, we're in a period where truth is quite slippery. So what it means to say no, no, we're actually going to set the actual document to music. Somebody actually said this,
Hmm.
and music will tell you what's in between the lines of what they said, and will go deeper than the actual quotation.
Hmm.
But for me, the idea that in this point where truth is so challenged, that we're making operas out of things people really said and really did, and that we put right up against that and 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 weave that together with poetry, which is what Aristotle said. Poetry is more important than history because history is what happened and poetry is what might happen. And so, which is also what music does. Music gives possibility. Suddenly, possibility is present. And so, to create the interface between the documentation and the poetry, and create this work of art that leads to the possible, the unimaginable, and suddenly we're in an imaginative place because
Hmm.
poetry takes us to the place that invites us to imagine something else.
you know, but of course, Beaumarchais libretti are just phenomenal examples of the art form. Also, Handel was working with a lot of different people writing his libretti. Uh, Wagner chose to work with himself. So it doesn't have to be a great libretto to get to a great opera. Or there are, because there are great operas without great libretti.
Yeah,
There
but I have to
are,
say,
I don't know
Mark,
that.
I do feel that, it would be like saying a great movie doesn't need a screenplay. Actually, you know, most great operas have great libretti. I really believe that. I believe De Ponte made these things for Mozart that he didn't make for other people. So I think
Yeah,
Mozart had a very big role to
yeah.
play in it. Don't get me wrong. I give Mozart incredible credit for what those libretti are. But nonetheless, to me, Handel worked with some of the leading people of his day, and he again he had access to the greatest writers, and he worked with a lot of them. So, to me, it's an interesting question. I think it's a holdover from the worst era in opera when the libretto you could set the phone book to music, it would be fine. And to me, that's actually one of the problems with a lot of 20th century operas is that attitude prevailed. And so there are a lot of operas with fantastic music that have almost nothing to say because the libretti are so bad. And so I have to say, for me, every once in a while, there's of course a composer like Messiaen's libretto for St. Francis is kind of beyond belief, and he also has the words of St. Francis to go on, which are not bad.
Right,
but,
right.
but I mean, to me, it's important, as you said earlier, that there has to be something worthy of inspiring not only music, but inspiring changes in people's lives. You know, those words have to reach deep, have to touch something deep. And for me, the stronger the words are, guess what? The stronger the music is.
Hmm.
And guess what? The stronger the audience's feelings are. So I think in opera, it's not just the composer's game. Everybody has to be at the top of their game. The scenery has to be beautiful. You have to bring people into a world that's visually opens them, opens people's sense of vision and possibility. You know, the dance has to be, you know, we're not going to be stuck. We're not going to be in a time of political paralysis. We need dance. Let's move through this, which Mozart did and which Prince did. It's like, get people dancing. Stop standing there. And again, for me, the sad era of opera was when people stood there and thought the libretto was worthless.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Verdi worked so hard on every libretto.
Yep.
He was very serious about, no, I'm not going to have one wasted word.
Right.
He because he wanted words to become action, which is what we want politically. We don't want a society of spectacle where we stand by and watch the spectacle. We actually need what the Greeks made opera for, which was ritual. A ritual is something you're part of. You're not there to watch, you're there to be in it. You're there, it's there about, you're made to take action. This music is meant to activate you in your life, and not just you individually, but all of us as a community to move forward together. And that's why Verdi wrote opera. That's why Handel made these oratorios. That's what Mozart had in mind, was action, which is why every aria is a piece of dance music, because it's movement. Let's move this thing. Let's move. Let's not just sit here and be trapped.
Hmm.
And I think that's, you know, Wagner's you know, energy is to move these huge structures forward. And so for me, opera is this activist location.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
meant to not be like a concert where you can sit there with your arms folded and think profound thoughts. Opera is, you know, nobody's arms are folded. It's about
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
this power of people working together. What can that create? And there's nothing like it, and there's no substitute.
So people working together, as you say, and I wanted to chat with you about sustained creative partnerships, because when I think of your great work, Peter, it is frequently in sustained partnerships with composers you've named, with some singers we know, with designers you've worked with, that clearly you value the long going, ongoing creative partnerships of artists. What's the value of getting to know one another over time through your artistic medium?
Well, as George Sipin, the great designer, says, it's all one production. You know, we're just doing one, we're trying to articulate one thing across our whole lifetime. And I do think of what we're doing as not piecework, but as life work. These things we're committed to across our lives, and across our lives, we're going to keep coming back and saying, now, how can we go farther? What else can we add? How can we go? And it's a body of work. And for me, the body of work means that we don't have to start from scratch every time. We can say, we got this far last time, let's pick up and go farther. And that sense that you're in the room with somebody you don't have to explain everything to, but we already have made really powerful breakthroughs together. And that's empowering us to make the next breakthrough. And 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 you know, with Lorraine Hunt or Dawn Upshaw, uh, you know, people I've worked with for decades. You know, it's an ongoing way of working. It's an ongoing understanding of what we're trying to touch and where we're trying to go. And those are difficult places to access. And
Hmm.
so when you find someone who can open up that emotional world and can take music to those heights, well, you want to keep working and keep working and keep working. And I'm not really involved with a kind of star system, which is very, uh, it's quite surface oriented. And for me, in order to work, and that's why I just don't work that often in opera houses, and I work mostly in festivals where you just have time, where you have time to just spend time with people and not just deal with your first, second, and third idea, but get to your 15th and 30th idea. Just like
Hmm.
keep saying, wait a minute, there's still a kernel of something we're not touching here. How can we find it? How can we go deeper into this? So that is so exhilarating. And to work with Amin Malouf across years, to work with Alice Goodwin across years, of course. And it means also to work with someone like John Adams, who, well, there's no one like John Adams, but to work with John, who, for example, no two operas are remotely the same.
Hmm.
There are many composers for whom, okay, you heard one and you kind of know what the others are going to be.
Hmm.
John, every single piece is some new musical world, some new sound imprint, some new way it moves, some new kind of texture. Each opera is a new event, is a new breakthrough for John, and I have to say that's so impressive. So, in a way, that's beautiful about being able to create a body of work and also keep that work changing up all the time
Hmm.
and not saying, okay, I mean, as you know, in the 80s and 90s, so many famous artists just became, they realized that the money was about branding. And so they created an artwork that you could say, oh, right, that's an Andy Warhol, like right away. But for me, branding is a little the opposite. What we're trying to say is each situation suddenly calls for new awareness, new depth of understanding, new emotional approaches,
Hmm.
and new political and historical awareness. And so to make a body of work with people, but have that body of work continue to change and evolve and tackle new frontiers and new edges of experience, that's that's just exhilarating. So I'm so grateful for this amazing people I work with every day because, again, I do nothing. I mean, a director can sit in a room alone and nothing will happen. Things only happen when everyone else comes into the room.
And it's good that you started young, so these relationships can be so long-standing.
Well, also, it's we also started as young people, so we remember the things we cared about.
Yeah,
Because the world over time
yeah,
gives you a lot of reasons to no longer care so much about certain
right,
things.
right.
So it's cool to have the first flame always in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I can identify with that. In your incredible career trajectory, role models, whether they knew it or not, or mentors, whether they knew it or not.
Well, I don't ever think of anything as a career because, it's like it's a life. And what do you want in your life? Go ahead and live that life. So for me, it's never a career, it's always life choices. And what do you want to have in your life? Who do you want to have in your life? Go ahead and live that life. Um, and of course, my life was changed by so many teachers, so many great people. I mean, obviously, most everybody I'm working with is my teacher because I'm just there to learn from these amazing people. I'm not a great musician, so I'm surrounded by great musicians. I'm not a painter, so I'm surrounded by amazing visual artists. I'm not a writer, so I'm surrounded by incredible writers. The I think the deepest and kind of most beautiful part of that is the sense that something keeps you moving that is not necessarily from inside you, is that it's when you start to work and get into the habit of working with a community of people, the community itself provides the momentum.
Hmm.
And nonetheless, there are exceptional individuals. And of course, for example, Gerard Mortier was of course, changed my life completely. And I think probably it's, the Metropolitan Opera for its 100th anniversary had this giant, you were there, Mark, right? This
I
giant
was
gathering.
there. Yep.
And so, and they decided that, they should have something new also represented, in the 3 days of gatherings of famous people. And so I was invited to present, which was shocking at that era. And they put me in the Sheraton, my little talk with my little panel was at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning after Kovanshchina. So it was clear no one would be there. And so, we talked about what the young generation was thinking of in opera. I was like 25 or 26 at the time.
Hmm.
And and there was a scattering of sleepy people kind of, about 10 rows, 13 rows out there somewhere in the dim ballroom. And then, I thought, okay, well, that's over. And then I said, I might as well hang out. I'm here. I should hear what people are saying. And there was this amazing panel of, the future of opera from the point of view of, several, Beverly Sills was there, people who ran opera companies. And every single one of them talked about their subscription season, the marketing, the, you know, and then they got to this guy who ran the Brussels Opera House. And he didn't mention the subscription season. He didn't talk about ticket sales. He said, "We are living in a world of so many lies. There has to be a place where every night at 8 o'clock, somebody can lift the curtain and see what's behind it." What? And he said, we're going through our lives not knowing how to breathe. There has to be a place we can go where people are breathing deeply and therefore able to create beauty that's unbelievable and inspiring. I thought, wow, I think I have to meet this guy. And then the next question that was asked him, he said, well, actually, there's a very interesting young man who spoke this morning named Peter Sellars. And he said, and Gerard started quoting me. And he had been at the
Wow.
9 a.m. session. So we had to meet. And then he began really supporting my work, and my European debuts and so on were with him. And then of course when he took over the Salzburg Festival,
Sure.
we were planning together things like the Messe in Saint Francois and these real breakthroughs. So of course my life was only possible because of amazing people. There's not one thing I've ever done alone, and well, there's not one thing any human being does alone. We all need everyone in our lives.
Wow. What a great story. A great story about being quoted by Mortier the session after yours. That's fantastic. Um, your Salzburg address, Listening to the Ocean, Planetary Change and Cultural Action, your class at UCLA, Arts as Social Action and as Moral Action. And you have said it throughout our conversation today about the intersection of opera and the way we want to change the world for the better, and the way the great artists had a vision of how we needed to move and moved us. So in many ways, you've touched on it, but I wanted to be explicit in bringing out this question, because so often people want to treat opera like another season of Downton Abbey. Let's do some what I call time travel entertainment.
Right.
And opera for many is a retreat from the challenges of the day rather than a step into the challenges of the day. So again, I wanted to be explicit in hearing you talk about this interconnection between opera and our world, or the world we want to live in.
You know, uh, I think opera, one of the things that, I'm obsessed with Rameau at the moment because, of course, Rameau, for example,
Mm.
wrote operas where a river was a character. And there's a whole opera about the winds, and it's like, hello, the human and the non-human are totally interpenetrating. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things, that so much music is about water. So much music is about the natural world. And Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, but those things were already part of Bach, they were part of Handel. That music is about the connection of the human to the non-human, and about the fact that the rocks are weeping and the rocks are singing. That's Orfeo. That's the beginning of opera, is that even the rocks speak. And in fact, the rocks have a lot to say. And the rocks are history, and the rocks are waiting for us to move. We can move, they're not allowed to. And so, just to say, uh, the beauty of opera is, as you said, it's, first of all, it's not that we have to create change. Change is the given. And it's watching people resist change that's sad, because, of course, their skin is changing, their eyesight is changing, everything's changing. You're not going to have anything. Nothing's going to stay. Everything's moving all the time. So can we move with it? And can, in some cases, we get a little bit ahead of the curve? And but change is the given. How do we move gracefully with change? And how do we let change release us from the things we're holding on to that we actually are going to have to let go of? We really are. And then how do we recognize ourselves again, not as spectators, but as actors, as people who are them? We're actually actively participating in moving forward what needs to move forward, and letting go of those parts of ourselves and those parts of our society that are just self-defeating and damaging and self-destructive, and recognizing self-destructive behavior, and recognizing that not only are you destroying yourself, you're destroying the planet.
Hmm.
That's pretty intense. And our kind of vectors for self-destruction have rarely included, well, Wagner's trying to say, okay, hello, this has planetary consequences. Guess what? The river Rhine is drying up. That's pretty wild. And so just to say, opera has this beautiful way, because it's about a universe, it's about a world. Opera takes you into the place where everything in the world is connected. Everything affects everything. And opera is the art form to demonstrate that. So it's very important. In Salzburg, of course, the other beautiful thing about opera is it has two audiences, basically. One is the audience that has no money and comes anyway, and they're up in whatever balcony. And I was in that audience for years, which is why in my shows I always sit in the fifth balcony to see what it looks like, because that's how I saw opera. But also downstairs are the people who run the governments and the corporations, and you know um, Angela Merkel is there all the time. She
Yep.
goes. I mean, bless her. And so you are addressing the elite power structure, as well as a wild segment of the general population of crazy students and retired people. And the and so it's important to articulate those things that face all of us, that we're all facing. And opera is a perfect platform. So to talk about the oceans and the nature of the ocean uh, was logical, because I was doing Mozart's Idomeneo, where the ocean is a character, and the
Hmm.
ocean says to the king, "I'm sorry, you have to step down. You have actually defiled the planet, and I'm going to elevate the next generation because you have still not noticed what is at stake." And there's an opera about that called Idomeneo, and Mozart writes all this music for the ocean, and the ocean is definitely a character. And peace is only made once peace is made with the ocean. That is Homer. That is every ancient civilization, and that's why I invited artists from the Pacific Islands to come, from Kiribati, the first island that is going under right now in as the oceans rise, and to testify, to be present, because opera is about gathering people and saying, okay, let's gather everybody in the room to talk about this and to look at what's going on and to listen. And opera is about advanced listening. So anytime you can say something that should be listened to, not just the way you listen to the news, but listen to deeply with your heart, we go for it.
Peter Sellars, it is extraordinary to listen to you, to be inspired by you, and to understand some of the genesis of the great work that you've done for decades now. I am truly honored to have this time with you. We are so happy that you're part of this oral history of opera in America. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in person or otherwise at
Please,
the
at all
nearest
times, Mark.
possible opportunity.
Just all love to you. And again, thank you for taking Opera America forward, 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 forward. And
It's a team effort, and your inspiration will help a lot. Peter, have a good day, and thank you again.
bless you. Thank you so much,
Take
Mark.
care.
Lots of
Bye.
love.